The command center of Angel's Haven was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the computers and the occasional beep of a notification. Rich sat at his desk, his eyes focused on the datapad in front of him, reviewing the latest reports from the teams in the field. It had been a week since their successful raid on the slaver auction, and the Remnant Angels had been working tirelessly to follow up on the leads they had uncovered. But so far, progress had been slow, and Rich could feel the frustration building in his gut. Just as he was about to set the datapad aside and take a break, the door to the command center slid open, and Louise stepped inside. There was a look of excitement on the young man's face, and he was clutching a data drive in his hand. "Boss, you're going to want to see this," Louise said, his voice tight with barely contained enthusiasm. "I've been going through the data we recovered from the auction, and I found something big." Rich sat up straighter in his chair, his eyebrows raised. "Show me," he said, gesturing for Louise to take a seat at the console next to him. Louise plugged the data drive into the console and began typing furiously, his fingers flying over the keys. A moment later, a series of images and documents began to appear on the screen, each one more shocking than the last. "These are the locations of the biggest slaver operations in the galaxy," Louise said, pointing to a star map that was now displayed on the screen. "And these," he added, pulling up another document, "are the names of their biggest buyers." Rich leaned forward, his eyes scanning the information in front of him. He recognized some of the names on the list: wealthy businessmen, corrupt politicians, even a few high-ranking military officials. But there were others he didn't know, names that sent a chill down his spine. "This is incredible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "With this information, we could strike a blow against the slave trade that they would never recover from." Louis nodded, a grim smile on his face. "That's what I was thinking. But we need to move fast. Who knows how long this information will stay valid?" Rich nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. He pulled up the list of buyers again and began to cross-reference it with the names of those who had been killed in the raid on the auction. "Looks like we took out a good number of them already," he said, his finger tracing down the list. "But there are still plenty left, and as long as there are buyers, there will always be slavers willing to supply them." He sat back in his chair, his eyes distant as he considered their next move. Then, with a suddenness that made Louis jump, he stood up and activated the base-wide comm system. "Attention all Remnant Angels," he said, his voice ringing out through the base. "This is Rich. I need everyone to report to the main hangar bay immediately. We have a new mission, and it's going to take every single one of us to see it through." He turned to Louise, a fierce determination burning in his eyes. "Get everything we have on these slaver operations and their buyers loaded onto the main server," he said. "We're going to need it." Louise nodded and set to work, his fingers flying over the keys once again. Rich watched him for a moment, a sense of pride and purpose swelling in his chest. They had the information they needed, the tools to strike a blow against the slave trade that would be felt across the galaxy. And with the Remnant Angels at his side, he knew that there was nothing they couldn't accomplish. It was time to take the fight to the slavers, to show them that their days of preying on the innocent were numbered. And the Remnant Angels would be the ones to deliver that message, loud and clear. The main hangar bay of Angel's Haven was a sea of faces, the Remnant Angels gathered from every corner of the base. There was a buzz of excitement and anticipation in the air, a sense that something big was about to happen. At the front of the room, Rich stood on a raised platform, his eyes sweeping over the assembled crowd. Beside him, his core team stood at attention, their expressions serious but filled with determination. "Thank you all for coming," Rich began, his voice amplified by the speakers mounted on the walls. "I know you're all busy with your own assignments and missions, but what I'm about to tell you is going to change everything." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then, with a deep breath, he continued. "We've uncovered a wealth of information about the biggest slaver operations in the galaxy and the buyers who keep them in business. And with this information, we have an opportunity to strike a blow against the slave trade that they will never recover from." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd, the Remnant Angels shifting and nodding to one another. They had all seen the horrors of slavery firsthand, had all sworn to do whatever it took to end the vile practice once and for all. But it's not going to be easy, Rich warned, his voice growing serious. These slavers are well-funded, well-armed, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their profits. If we're going to take them down, it's going to take every single one of us working together. He brought up a holographic display of the galaxy, the locations of the slaver operations glowing red against the star field. Our plan is simple, but it's going to require precision and coordination. We're going to hit them where it hurts, starting with their supply chains. The display zoomed in on a cluster of red dots, highlighting the biggest and most notorious slaver operations. These are our first targets. We're going to hit them hard and fast, cutting off their ability to acquire new slaves and disrupting their operations. The Remnant Angels nodded, their expressions grim but determined. They knew the stakes, knew the risks they would be taking. But they also knew that it was a risk worth taking, a fight worth fighting. Once we've dealt with the supply side, we're going to turn our attention to the buyers, Rich continued, the display shifting to highlight the names and locations of the biggest slave owners in the galaxy. We're going to make it clear to them that their days of profiting from the suffering of others are over, and that they will be held accountable for their crimes. A cheer went up from the assembled Remnant Angels, a roar of approval that shook the hangar bay. They were ready to take the fight to the slavers and bring justice to the oppressed. Rich raised his hands, calling for quiet. I know you're all eager to get started, he said, a smile on his face. And believe me, I am too. But we need to do this right. We need to be smart, and we need to be careful. He brought up a list of assignments on the display, each one matched to a specific team of Remnant Angels. I've divided up the targets based on your skills and experience. You'll each have a specific operation to take down, a specific set of buyers to go after. The Remnant Angels nodded, their eyes scanning the list and memorizing their assignments. They trusted Rich, trusted his judgment and his leadership. If he said this was the way to take down the slavers, then that was what they would do. As for my team, Rich said, his voice growing serious once again, we'll be going after the biggest and most dangerous of them all, the Workmen's Syndicate. A hush fell over the room at the mention of the notorious slaver group, the one responsible for some of the worst atrocities in the galaxy. They were a feared and hated name, a symbol of everything the Remnant Angels stood against. It won't be easy, Rich warned, his eyes blazing with determination. But we're going to take them down, no matter what it takes. We're going to show them that their days of terror and oppression are over, and that the Remnant Angels will never stop fighting for what's right. The hangar bay erupted in cheers and applause, the Remnant Angels ready and eager to begin their new mission. They knew the risks, knew the challenges that lay ahead. But they also knew that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves, for a cause that was worth any sacrifice. As the teams began to disperse, heading off to make their preparations and gather their gear, Rich turned to his core team, a fierce pride burning in his eyes. This is it, he said, his voice low and intense. This is our chance to make a real difference, to strike a blow against the slavers that they'll never forget. Are you with me? The answer was immediate and unanimous, a resounding chorus of agreement and determination. They were the Remnant Angels, the guardians of the innocent and the protectors of the weak, and they would not rest until the galaxy was free from the scourge of slavery once and for all. The industrial world of Zorgon Prime loomed before the Remnant Angels' ship, a gray and lifeless orb hanging in the void of space. It was a world of factories and refineries, of sprawling industrial complexes and towering smokestacks that belched noxious fumes into the atmosphere. And somewhere down there, hidden among the labyrinthine streets and alleyways, was the heart of the Workmen's Syndicate's slaving operation. Rich stood on the bridge of the ship, his eyes fixed on the viewscreen as they made their approach. Beside him, his core team was making their final preparations, checking their weapons and armor, going over the plan one last time. They had spent the past week gathering intelligence on the Syndicate's operation, studying their defenses and looking for weak points in their security. It had been a tense and nerve-wracking process, made all the more difficult by the Syndicate's fearsome reputation. The Workmen's Syndicate was known throughout the galaxy as one of the most brutal and ruthless slaver groups in existence. They were a well-oiled machine, with a vast network of informants, enforcers, and corrupt officials that made them almost untouchable. But the Remnant Angels were not afraid. They had faced worse odds before, had gone up against enemies that would have made even the bravest warriors quail in fear. And they had always emerged victorious, always found a way to overcome the impossible. As the ship touched down on the outskirts of the Syndicate's stronghold, Rich turned to his team, his expression serious but filled with determination. "Remember the plan," he said, his voice low and intense. "We go in fast and hard, take out their defenses before they have a chance to react. We're looking for their central command center, where their leadership will be holed up." The team nodded, their faces set with grim determination. They knew the stakes, knew the risks they were taking. But they also knew that this was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. As they made their way through the winding streets and alleyways of the industrial complex, Rich couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The Syndicate had eyes everywhere, and he knew that they would stop at nothing to protect their operation. But the Remnant Angels were ready for them. They moved quickly and silently, their weapons at the ready, their senses heightened to a razor's edge. They had trained for this moment, had honed their skills to perfection. And when the first wave of Syndicate enforcers attacked, they were ready. The battle was fierce and bloody, a whirlwind of blaster fire and hand-to-hand combat that left the streets littered with bodies. But the Remnant Angels fought with a skill and ferocity that was unmatched, their every move a symphony of precision and power. They pushed forward, inch by hard-fought inch, their eyes fixed on their ultimate goal. They knew that the Syndicate's leadership would be well protected, hidden behind layers of defenses and guarded by their most elite warriors. But they also knew that they had no choice. If they were going to strike a blow against the slave trade, if they were going to bring justice to the oppressed and freedom to the enslaved, then they had to reach the heart of the Syndicate's operation. And so they fought on, their determination never wavering, their courage never failing. They were the Remnant Angels, the guardians of the innocent and the protectors of the weak. And they would not rest until their mission was complete. As they made their way deeper into the Syndicate stronghold, Rich could feel the anticipation building in his gut. They were close now, so close that he could almost taste the victory that lay ahead. But he also knew that the hardest part was still to come. The Syndicate's leadership would not go down without a fight, and they would throw everything they had at the Remnant Angels in a desperate bid to protect their own skin. But Rich was ready for them. He had a plan, a strategy that would see them through to the end. And with his team by his side, he knew that there was nothing they couldn't accomplish. The Remnant Angels moved through the corridors of the Workman Syndicate's stronghold like a well-oiled machine, their every step a symphony of precision and power. They had breached the outer defenses, had fought their way past the Syndicate's elite guards and into the heart of their operation. But the real battle was just beginning. Rich led the way, his blaster held at the ready, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Behind him, his team fanned out in a protective formation, their weapons trained on every possible angle of attack. They knew that the Syndicate's leadership would be heavily guarded, that they would have to fight their way through a gauntlet of enforcers and defenses to reach their target. But they also knew that they had no choice. If they were going to bring down the Syndicate, if they were going to strike a blow against the slave trade that would be felt across the galaxy, then they had to press on. As they rounded a corner, they found themselves face to face with a wall of heavily armed Syndicate warriors, their blasters trained on the Remnant Angels with deadly precision. For a moment, the two sides stared each other down, the tension in the air so thick that it could be cut with a knife. Then, with a roar of fury, the Syndicate warriors opened fire. The corridor erupted in a hail of blaster bolts, the air filled with the acrid smell of ozone and the screams of the dying. The Remnant Angels dove for cover, their own weapons blazing as they returned fire with deadly accuracy. It was a fierce and desperate battle, with neither side giving an inch. The Syndicate warriors fought with a fanatical devotion to their cause, their every move a testament to their brutality and their cruelty. But the Remnant Angels were more than a match for them. They fought with a skill and a determination that was unmatched, their every shot a message of defiance and resolve. And slowly, painfully, they began to turn the tide. Rich was a whirlwind of motion, his blaster flashing as he cut down the Syndicate warriors with ruthless efficiency. Beside him, Nora and Trevor fought with a ferocity that bordered on the inhuman, their every move a blur of speed and power. And at their backs, the rest of the team pressed forward, their weapons blazing as they pushed the Syndicate warriors back step by bloody step. It was a long and brutal fight, with casualties on both sides. But in the end, the Remnant Angels emerged victorious, the last of the Syndicate warriors falling before their relentless advance. As they paused to catch their breath and tend to their wounds, Rich could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the rush of victory that came with knowing that they were one step closer to their goal. But he also knew that they couldn't afford to rest, that every moment they delayed was another moment that the Syndicate's leadership had to prepare for their final stand. With a nod to his team, Rich led the way deeper into the stronghold, his blaster held at the ready, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. They were close now, so close that he could almost taste the victory that lay ahead. But he also knew that the hardest part was still to come. The Syndicate's leadership would be heavily armed and well protected, and they would stop at nothing to hold onto their power and their profits. But the Remnant Angels were ready for them. They had come too far, had fought too hard, to turn back now. They would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. As they made their way through the twisting corridors and fortified chambers of the stronghold, Rich could feel the anticipation building in his gut. They were on the verge of something great, something that would change the course of history forever. And with his team by his side, he knew that there was nothing they couldn't accomplish. The Remnant Angels stood before the massive blast doors that separated them from the heart of the Workmen Syndicate's operation. They had fought their way through a gauntlet of defenses and guards, had battled their way past every obstacle that the slavers had thrown in their path. But now, they faced their greatest challenge yet. Rich stepped forward, his eyes scanning the reinforced metal of the doors, looking for any weakness or vulnerability that they could exploit. But the doors were heavily fortified, designed to withstand even the most determined assault. He turned to Nora, his expression grim. "We need to get through those doors," he said, his voice low and intense. "Whatever it takes." Nora nodded, her own expression mirroring his. She knew what was at stake, knew that the fate of countless innocent lives hung in the balance. With a nod to the rest of the team, she stepped forward, her hands moving in a complex pattern as she prepared to use her telekinetic abilities to force the doors open. But before she could begin, Trevor held up a hand, a sudden thought occurring to him. "Wait," he said, his voice urgent. "I have an idea." He reached into his pack and pulled out a handful of small, spherical devices, each one no larger than a marble. With a flick of his wrist, he sent them rolling towards the base of the doors, where they came to rest with a soft clink. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a blinding flash of light and a deafening roar, the devices detonated, the force of the explosion tearing through the reinforced metal like tissue paper. The Remnant Angels charged forward, their weapons at the ready, their eyes fixed on the smoke-filled opening that now gaped before them. They knew that the Syndicate's leadership would be waiting for them, that they would be heavily armed and desperate to protect their own skin. But they were ready for them. As they burst into the chamber beyond, they found themselves face to face with the Syndicate's elite guards, a wall of heavily armed and armored warriors who seemed to fill every inch of the room. For a moment, the two sides stared each other down, the tension in the air so thick that it could be cut with a knife. Then, with a roar of fury, the guards opened fire. The chamber erupted in a hail of blaster bolts, the air filled with the acrid smell of ozone and the screams of the dying. The Remnant Angels dove for cover, their own weapons blazing as they returned fire with deadly accuracy. It was a fierce and desperate battle, with neither side giving an inch. The guards fought with a fanatical devotion to their masters, their every move a testament to their brutality and their cruelty. But the Remnant Angels were more than a match for them. They fought with a skill and a determination that was unmatched, their every shot a message of defiance and resolve. And at the center of it all was Rich, a whirlwind of motion and fury as he cut through the guards like a hot knife through butter. His blaster flashed and his fists flew, every move a symphony of precision and power. And then, as the last of the guards fell and the smoke began to clear, he saw them. The leaders of the workmen's syndicate, the men and women who had profited from the suffering of countless innocent lives, huddled together in a corner of the room, their eyes wide with fear and desperation. Rich approached them slowly, his blaster trained on their hearts, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury. He had waited so long for this moment, had dreamed of the day when he would finally bring these monsters to justice. And now, that day had come. One by one, he confirmed their identities, making sure that every last one of them was accounted for. And then, with a final decisive shot, he ended their reign of terror once and for all. As the last of the syndicate's leaders fell, Rich turned to his team, his expression one of grim satisfaction. They had done it. They had struck a blow against the slave trade that would be felt across the galaxy, had brought justice to the oppressed and freedom to the enslaved. But even as they savored their victory, Rich knew that their work was far from over. There were still other slaver groups out there, still other monsters who profited from the suffering of the innocent. And the remnant angels would not rest until they had brought them all to justice. With a final nod to his team, Rich activated his comm, his voice ringing out across the syndicate's channels. "This is Rich Greaves of the Remnant Angels," he said, his voice filled with a fierce determination. "The Workmen's Syndicate is finished. Their leaders are dead, and their operation is in ruins." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then, with a voice that was as hard and unyielding as steel, he delivered his final message. "To anyone else out there who thinks they can profit from the suffering of others, know this: the Remnant Angels are coming for you. We will not rest until every last slaver is brought to justice, until every last slave is free." And with that, he cut the transmission, his eyes blazing with a fierce and unquenchable fire. The journey back to Angel's Haven was a somber one, the weight of their victory tempered by the knowledge of the long road still ahead. The Remnant Angels had struck a mighty blow against the Workmen's Syndicate, had brought justice to the oppressed and freedom to the enslaved. But they knew that their work was far from over. As they gathered in the main hall of the base, the mood was one of grim determination. The other teams had returned from their own missions, each one bearing tales of victory and sacrifice, of battles fought and won in the name of justice and freedom. But even as they celebrated their successes, they knew that the fight against the slave trade was far from over. There were still other slaver groups out there, still other monsters who profited from the suffering of the innocent. And the Remnant Angels would not rest until they had brought them all to justice. Rich stood before his assembled teams, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the faces of the men and women who had become his family, his brothers and sisters in arms. They had been through so much together, had faced down the worst that the galaxy had to offer and emerged stronger for it. And now they stood on the brink of something truly great, something that would change the course of history forever. "My friends," he said, his voice ringing out across the hall, "we have struck a mighty blow against the forces of oppression and cruelty. We have shown the galaxy that the Remnant Angels will not rest until every last slave is free, until every last slaver is brought to justice." A cheer went up from the assembled teams, a roar of approval that shook the very foundations of the base. They were ready to take the fight to the enemy, to bring hope and freedom to the oppressed masses of the galaxy. But Rich held up a hand, his expression growing serious. "But our work is far from over," he said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "There are still other slaver groups out there, still other monsters who profit from the suffering of others. And we will not rest until they are all brought to justice." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then, with a voice that was as hard and unyielding as steel, he laid out their next steps. "We have identified the remaining slaver groups and their leaders," he said, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "We have the intelligence we need to take them down, to cut off the head of the beast once and for all." He turned to his core team, his expression one of grim resolve. "We will lead the charge," he said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "We will take on the worst of the worst, the most heavily defended and well-armed of the slaver groups, and we will not rest until they are all brought to justice." The other teams nodded, their own expressions mirroring his. They were ready, ready to follow him into the very heart of darkness, to bring light and hope to the oppressed masses of the galaxy. And so, with a final nod of determination, the Remnant Angels set to work. They pored over intelligence reports and sensor readings, planned their attacks and coordinated their strikes. They worked tirelessly, driven by a fierce and unquenchable desire to see justice done, to bring freedom to the enslaved. And as they labored, they knew that they were not alone. All across the galaxy, other groups were rising up, other freedom fighters and rebels who had heard the call of the Remnant Angels and taken up arms against the forces of oppression. Together they formed a coalition of the willing, a network of resistance that stretched from one end of the galaxy to the other. And with each passing day, their strength grew, their resolve hardened. For they knew that the road ahead would be long and hard, that there would be setbacks and challenges at every turn. But they also knew that they had something that the slavers could never take away: hope. Hope for a better future. Hope for a galaxy free from the scourge of slavery and oppression. And with that hope burning bright in their hearts, they pressed on, determined to see their mission through to the end. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Remnant Angels. Be sure to check out the rest of the series if you've missed any of this exciting journey. Also, be sure to leave a like and subscribe too. I'll see you in the next one.